Number one, keep it simple. Keep it simple. Okay? Secondly, get to the point quickly. Don't squander the first few minutes. Now, we minister today, and I think actually every year I do this, this critical time gets shorter and shorter. I put down here the first 3 minutes. I actually think now it's less than that. We minister to people in today's culture. And what I do, now, in my household, if I sit on the sofa and I'm sitting in front of the TV and I have the remote control, now the temptation is what I do, and this is why my wife doesn't allow me to have the remote control, because if there's nothing particularly on, what I would do, I would go click, 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 click. And she said, don't do that, give it to me. People, and especially young, now there is an age thing here, but many people are sitting listening to me and you with a remote control in their mind, okay? And they're thinking, who are they going to switch to? They might be sitting there, but they're thinking, are they going to switch their attention to you? Or are they going to switch their attention to something else in their mind? And so the first few minutes should answer the question, why should I listen? You should answer the question, why should I listen to this person? Because ultimately, that's what people are thinking. Why should I listen to this person? And I actually find that opening segment the hardest thing to do. It is the hardest thing. On the whole, because of my background and my training, I'm pretty good. I can exposit a text. I can do all of that because I've been doing it for years and years, for decades. It's a skill you learn. But in the end, I have a message. I know what I want to say. I know what God's word wants to say. I have even an outline, but where do I start? And I personally find that the hardest thing, because I realise it's that critical first few minutes, or actually with young people, it's probably going to be the first few seconds. Haddon Robinson, again, I like this quote. There are 3 types of preachers. Those to whom you cannot listen, those to whom you can listen, and those to whom you must listen. And during the introduction, the congregation usually decides the kind of speaker addressing them that morning or afternoon. So I'm arranging my points. I want to get to the heart of this quickly. And it's difficult. Personally, I find that difficult. Okay. 3, state your points in complete sentences. You might have an outline, but the outline, if it's just an outline describing the text, it might not say much. And there's an example here from Luke 18, 6-8, the helpless, the helper, the appeal, the encouragements. But although that might in some ways describe the text, I've said this yesterday, our points need to be so clear that someone can understand the message by looking at the outline. That's a good test, isn't it? So if all someone had was the text you're using and your outline, they would understand the message. That would be helpful, wouldn't it? So that we're being sharp on this. You know, I want people to understand this. Make sure your points have unity and balance. And we thought about that the other day, using category words. In other words, good descriptive word, rather than here are 5 things God wants of things. It's just, here are 3 dangers God's word warns us of. Here are 5 habits for a mature disciple. Here are 4 implications of Jesus' resurrection. They're better, aren't they? Rather than 4 things. And actually that word in itself, the implications of the actually about that, most of the New Testament is dealing with the implications of the resurrection. Most of the New Testament deals with what's the implications. Christ has risen from the dead, that there are some massive implications, and you could say the whole of the New Testament is working out what that means. Make sure your points follow a clear logical progression. We talked a little bit about that. Not necessarily linear. And again, there is a point here about who you're speaking to, I think. But I think, here's the quote, your message must have movement if you want to move people. There has to be some sort of momentum and movement. A guy called Dave Buttrick read a book called Homiletic Moods and Structures, and in the book he says a sermon is not a series of points but moves. It's a little bit like, not that I do this, but dancing, not just kind of disco dancing, but proper dancing is a sequence of moves, yeah, in the right order, and it's those moves which lead to the momentum and hopefully something which looks quite beautiful. So that's a much more creative way of looking at a structure, not just points which might be more mathematical, but something more creative. It's a sense of moves. Think of it as a dance. Think of it as like a piece of music, a symphony. Now a symphony can also be analysed mathematically as you look at the structure to that. But actually, you don't sit there thinking, "Oh wow, look at the logical sequence of these notes."
How many sets of?
How many? Yeah, and and there are various forms, like a sonata form of music, which speaks about the. But actually, you just listen to it, and there's a sense of movement, and then hopefully at the end, it comes together. So the crescendo. There are actually pieces of music where that's not the case. Have you heard of? I was going to say Tchaikovsky, and in particular Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, which was his last symphony, and there are 4 movements, and the third movement. I always used to love this as a child. It just kind of erupts, and it's as if this is the crescendo, and it ends. But then there's a 4th movement, which is actually a very quiet movement. Wow, that's odd, because you normally think, don't you? You're going to the mountaintop. So you need to work this out, and you can actually be quite creative about this. But you're looking for movement. There are transitions there. Here are some examples: outlines with movements. Tell them why, show them how. Tell them why, show them how. Tell them why this is important, show them how. Or establish a need, give personal examples, present a plan, offer hope, call for commitment, expect results. Here's another one: what, so what, now what. In other words, there's a sense of movement. There is a. It might not be like mathematical logic, but there's a sense of we know where we're going. Okay. 6. Arrange your points to climax with a commitment. Now, I quite like doing this, really. And probably slightly disagree with Tim Keller, although actually I think Tim Keller does this too. I want my strongest point to be the climax. I want my strongest point to be the climax. But then I also want a strong point at the beginning. So you just need to work this out, because again, it's this sense of I want to grab people, and I realise that when I'm preaching, I have to wrestle for people's attention. I often have to wrestle for people's attention. Gone is the day when people will naturally give you their attention. I think in most situations, I have to fight for that. Not literally, but you know what I mean. Arrange your points to use tension and release. Tension and release. Okay, talks. I think a message has mountains and valleys. It has mountains and valleys, peaks and troughs. Sometimes, when you're listening to a message and it's a very powerful point, or maybe an emotional point, and you look at everyone listening, and they're on the edge of their seats, and some people are crying. That's great. But you can't have a whole message like that, because people will be exhausted. Isn't that true?
Yeah, some people do that. They scream and push for 20 minutes, and you're...
So if you're going to scream at any point, then make sure it's the most important thing. I'm not a screamer, but I do get excited. But I have to be aware, because I get excited when I'm communicating. If I'm excited all the time, then again, it's just like it's just a line. But if there are points where, what's my most powerful point? That's the thing. That's where we're going. So I need to be wise, don't I? Otherwise, people will get exhausted, and they won't listen to you. The saying throughout the whole length of the message. So, peaks and troughs. Consider how your points sound when arranging them. Consider how your points sound. Now, okay, when I prepare a message, this is a bigger point. A message is a spoken form of communication. Okay, it's not an essay. If I was writing an essay, I would write something in a certain way. But a sermon is not an essay. Now, I'm sure that you've heard someone give up to give a message, and it's as if they're reading from a piece of paper. That's not a message, that's an essay. So when I'm preparing a message, now I have a pretty full script. I use a pretty full script. But as I'm preparing, I'm sometimes speaking sections out loud. I want to know how it sounds. I want to know, is there movement there? So by the time I give the message, hopefully, I'm not reading it, because I have practiced this so often, I just know where I'm going. But I'm interested in how it sounds. And that's just being wise, isn't it? Which therefore means that when I give a message normally on a Sunday morning, I would have actually spoken that out loud many, many times. In fact, very often I will be in church very early. I get into church. My first service is at 9 in the morning, then at 10:15. I normally get in about 7, and we do a final run through on the computer. But then I will often, to an empty church, preach the sermon. For a number of reasons. Firstly, I'm getting familiar again with what I'm doing, but it also, how does it sound? And I've often got a pen. No, it doesn't sound quite right. Let's just try again. So it's how does it sound?
Doesn't that also set your tone, your kind of tone for an empty church? And it allows you to adjust to how your church would feel when it's full.
I think, I imagine it's full. But I just find it helpful, and I've got the ability to do that. But even once I prepared it, there are still maybe a few times I'm going to go through it. So there's a lot of preparation there. Even once you've done it, I want to know, how does this sound? How does this sound?
how many times do you usually give your sermon to practice before you do it?
Well, when I actually write it, put it together, I'll do a bit and then I'll stop and then I'll just speak it out. I'm also timing as well. How long does this take? How long does this take? So the whole process is one not just of writing and thinking, but of speaking stuff out. And then when it's finished, I will give it, and I might do that a couple of times. So for some messages, if I'm properly prepared, it might be 2-3 times. Now, I also get an idea by how many notes I've got, I kind of get the sense of how long it's going to take. But sometimes I will time it. Sometimes I will time it too, because I just need to. And the problem is, it's when there's that moment when you think, this is just too long. And so what I can do sometimes is I can make a decision to say, actually, I have 2 messages here. And I have the ability to say, okay, I'll give this the next part next week. Now, that's especially true in my culture. Patterns of church going has changed over the past 20 or 30 years, even amongst the committed. So, not everybody is going to be there every week. I don't know what it's like in the States. So that you might get people who are there twice a month or 3 times a month, but they're not necessarily there every month. So that also gives me the opportunity to realise that the week after I will do a short recap. But it's all about how does this sound. And I want this to be as natural as possible. And when it comes to jokes, we'll think about that later, but jokes and illustrations are really important, but you just need to know how you transition in and how you transition out. And sometimes you've just got to speak it out just to work out the best way of doing that. I also, because I know who I'm speaking to on the whole, I know that there are going to be certain things which will get a laugh, and there will be certain people who we can have a bit of fun, bit of banter with, and I know that in the preparation. And that's quite good too, because what that does, sometimes it just gives periods of light relief. It's this peaks and troughs. Sometimes in a message, you just need a chance for the congregation to go, whew, yeah, before you move on to the next point. And I will actually use media clips in that too. So that actually there'll be, I want to use a really good clip which illustrates something, but it's also just a slight, anyway.
So you write the whole sermon out?
Yeah.
And then you practice it 3
Yeah.
times out loud?
Yeah, I'll practice it.
And then you know it by heart?
Pretty much. I've got some. Yeah, so I normally, this is what I do on half. I need some A4 paper actually later. But so half A4 paper, and I just write things out. Yeah. Actually. Okay, I'll use this as an example. I've just looked at this. We're talking about starting a message. This is a message. Again, it was on part of the John's Gospel. And how do I start? So I started with a story. And you might have heard, a few weeks ago, there was a news report of it was an air accident. It wasn't an accident, it was an air incident report. The incident had happened on the 10th of March 2015. An Airbus A330 was scheduled to leave Sydney at 11:55 and arrive in Kuala Lumpur just 9 hours later. Now, to cut a long story short, there were a host of minor technical issues, which meant that the pilot was doing the pre-flight checks the first officer should have done, and the first officer was doing the pre-flight checks the pilot should have done. And in the end, it led to the wrong coordinates being tapped into the internal navigation system. Okay. I don't know if you've heard about this. And they took off, but the plane was going in the wrong direction. It was the wrong coordinates. You know, when you've got a sat nav, think of, and we had a joke about sat navs.
This was the accident with the Malaysian Air?
Well, no, it didn't crash, but the crew ignored 5 major sets of warning notifications from the computer. So the plane knew that something was wrong. There were warning alarms, there were messages coming up, but the crew ignored them. And it resulted in a positional error of 11,000 kilometers. In the end, the computer started screaming, terrain, terrain, which means you're going to hit something. And even then, the pilot didn't realise there was something. It got his attention, and it led ultimately to realising they'd tapped in the wrong. Now, this is the point. We all have faulty assumptions, yeah? And you assume certain things. That crew assumed that everything was fine. They had put the wrong information in, but it was wrong. And because they had faulty assumptions, they didn't see what was happening. And what you'll do, you'll see everything through the lenses of those faulty assumptions. And if that's true for a passenger jet, it's especially true for the Christian faith. People come with faulty assumptions, just like that crew. And that's exactly what happened with Jesus. People went with Jesus with faulty assumptions. So that was the way in. And I just thought, yeah, that kind of works, doesn't it? So you tell a story, and I also mentioned about sat-navs, and everyone nodded, and there's that connection, and I said, but actually it's true with the Christian faith. This is the danger of faulty assumptions. And this is exactly what happened in the text. People went to Jesus with faulty assumptions. So let's step back and let's see what assumptions we have. Are they true? Are they false? So it's just an example of how to start. I thought, yeah, well, that seemed to work. It seemed to connect. I was able to get people to smile. We had a bit of banter. But then it's that you shift it round, and if that's true for an airline trip, it's also true for Christians. Anyway, sorry, that's just slightly different. Provide an outline with the Bible verses written out. Now, whether this will work for you, I don't know. For me, of course, I'm in basically a settled situation, so I can do this. I provide an outline. So when people come into church, I'll provide a little outline, a message outline. But obviously, if you're on the road, you can't do that. That's just something I did. And that will contain the verses I want to use. It will contain my point. Sometimes I'll put a prayer on there. Sometimes if I want to use a prayer, everyone to use that together. If there are some questions I want to ask, I might put there, or some, and I find that helpful. Here are the reasons. Benefits. Unchurched people don't bring Bibles. It's very hard to do expository preaching if no one's got a Bible. We have it on the screen in our church, and we have this, but still, I'll say, we have Bibles in front of where people are sitting. And so we'll say, in front of the pew, so we'll say, we're on page, the reading's on page 684, let's open the Bibles together. There's just something, call me old-fashioned, there's something good about that. So anyway, but unchurched people don't bring Bibles, and it relieves embarrassment in finding a text too. Because if, sometimes you're in a church and you just assume people know their Bibles and you look up but sometimes people can't do that if they're new in. You can actually cover more material in less time as well. If you're asking people to look at certain separate verses, you don't have to wait until people look it up. So it's quicker. You can get through more in less time. You can have everyone read aloud together. So, there is a sense of sometimes, and that's a different, because actually in churches now, everyone's got a different translation anyway. But it means that, and I don't, maybe it's a cultural thing, but actually I've done this even in the UK. It's slightly American, I know, but even in the UK, I'll just say, let's read this together. Read this together. And if you've got, it means everyone's on the same page. They can review it later. It's another thing, isn't it? Actually, you can say it might be that you've structured the handout so that there are questions and comments, and you can say, actually, why didn't you look at this later? It can also be the basis for a small group discussion. So it wouldn't take a lot, actually, if you have a series of small groups, to turn this into a small group study. And if I knew that was going to happen, I would probably do that so that I could ask questions on the outline so that people can then look at that in the week. It allows you to use multiple translations. It increases participation. Again, I'm just asking people, I always say, I'm just wanting people to follow through with me. We have pens dotted about, and sometimes there are blanks, and I'll say, just fill in the blank. Without it, people forget 90% of what they hear in 72 hours. And I'm just trying everything to help people remember what we're doing. And at the very least, if they're hungry, they'll take this away and they can review that. They do have something they can take away. But that only works if you're in a settled situation. So I can understand that's probably not going to work for most of you for most of the time. But I've said it. Okay?